My name is Fulgencia Reggio Garcia. I am 83 years old and I was born in Capitabellosa. My parents had cattle and farmed the fields. Since we were little, all the brothers and sisters had to help. My father kept cattle in El Torno village, and we had to walk there because there were no bicycles. We lived in a stone hut in the countryside where we slept and stayed night and day. When we had the cattle well looked after, sometimes we would go to school for a while, but the main thing was the cattle. I remember that I only went to school for 3 months a year. We had to milk the goats by hand and made cheese with it to sell in other villages. I would go by donkey to sell it and I would leave very early. I'd fall asleep on the donkey most days, and I would always meet people on the way who would tell me, "One day you will fall off the donkey. Try not to fall asleep." I also had to work in the fields growing tobacco. However, my father didn't want me to work outside the house, but I liked to have some money so I could buy a dress for the village festivals and give a jacket to my brothers and sisters. During the other harvest months, I worked picking cotton and sowing peppers on a farm near Plasencia. This working life lasted from the age of 10 until I was 16. When I was 16, I went to help an uncle of mine in Plasencia because he was widowed and had a grocery store. I had to help him at home and in the shop without getting paid a penny for 6 years. When I was 24, I married a man who lived in Guillo de Granadilla while he learnt the trade of shoemaker. Eventually, he had to leave the profession because people stopped mending shoes. We became livestock farmers, and I was self-employed with the sheep to make contributions for my retirement, and we lived on the farm where the livestock was for many years. My son also helped us. When I retired, I tried to rest because we had worked a lot, but now I work embroidering table linen. I collaborate with the association and with the town council of Capitabellosa. Every year I help to cook the goat stew, which is made on the 8th of September for the typical local fiesta. The ingredients were pepper, onions, carrots, garlic, thyme, laurel, beer, wine, and cognac. Everything is added to the meat raw and cooked. My name is Rosario Sanchez Hernandez. I am 80 years old and I was adopted. I was born in Aldea Nueva del Camino. My mother died at the age of 30, leaving 4 children with me, 6, 4, 3, and 2 years old. We were poor. My father was a shepherd, and we didn't even have enough to eat. Shortly after my father was widowed, he married another woman, a very bad woman indeed. She was also a widow and had 2 children. She treated her children as such, but she treated us 4 as badly as she wanted. When I was 7 years old, she accused me of stealing a skirt and called the Guardia Civil, and that has always stayed with me. And the skirt was found having fallen behind her bed. When she felt like it, she would throw me out of the house, and I would walk alone to my grandparents' house, who lived in Gargantilla, until my father came to pick me up and bring me home. My sister and I were 9 and 6 years old when he brought us to Villa di Plasencia to work in houses. The lady of the house tested my sister and me to see who could sweep better. The master of the house said that he liked the little one better, but that the older one could do more work, and that is why they chose me. I suffered a lot when I was separated from my siblings. The family that took me into work eventually adopted me. They asked my father not to come to see me so that I would forget them. And the truth is that they succeeded. I lost my affection for my father, but not for my siblings. I was the servant of my adoptive parents, whom I called my aunt and uncle, but it never worked out for me to call them my parents. I scrubbed, picked olives, washed, looked after livestock, prepared meals, went to pick chestnuts, and so on. I was able to go to school, not every day, because there was always work to do, but I went when I could. The teacher told them I was good enough to study at university, but they never gave me an education, as they preferred to have me as a maid. When I was 21, they wouldn't let me get married, and I couldn't stand it any longer in that house, so I decided to get pregnant to get out of that martyrdom. It cost me dearly, because my pregnancy was a disgrace to society, not to mention my aunt and uncle, but I managed to get married. They threatened to throw me out of the house and disinherit me. I told them that they could do whatever they wanted, but that I was going to get married, and I was going to go with my husband, even if it was under a bridge. They made it difficult for us because they only helped me with 3 plates, 3 spoons, and 2 chairs. That was my dowry. My husband worked for his parents, and they gave him a daily wage of 200 pesetas, which we had to stretch as far as possible. It was a very hard life and a lot of sacrifice, but we managed to get by. We had 4 children. I had a hard birth with my first daughter. They had to use forceps during her birth, and I had to be treated in Plasencia. The doctor charged me 1,000 pesetas, and we only had 600 pesetas saved, so I had to go out and ask for money, but I paid it back as soon as I could. I have worked to ensure my retirement, and I have helped my children in their careers. I was able to fix up the house that my aunt and uncle left me, and in spite of everything, I've never lost my smile. I have been looking after my husband for 13 years now because he has Alzheimer's. My name is Maria Angeles Valencia Canon. I was born in Villa di Plasencia. We were 6 siblings. The boys emigrated to improve their lives. The girls stayed at home, except for one sister who went to Barcelona. I was able to go to school, but I never learned to read and write very well, so I devoted myself more to housework. At school, we were mainly taught embroidery and sewing. My mother died young, and my father never remarried, so I always stayed with him and took care of him until he died at the age of 94. I never married. The truth is that we never went hungry, but we couldn't eat everything we wanted to eat, and we only ate ham on special holidays. Eventually, my sisters got married, and that allowed me to travel around Spain, Madrid, Barcelona, and go to Jordan. On the first trip to Jordan, I stayed there for 3 months. It was the first time I was on the plane. That was in the 70s. I just got on the plane and they searched me, which was an unpleasant novelty for me, because I thought they were doing it because they suspected me of carrying drugs or something. And the only thing I kept repeating over and over again was that I didn't have any drugs. When the plane landed in Jordan, the same thing happened once again. A policeman frisked me. It was horrible between not knowing the language and not being able to read the airport signs to guide me and getting out of there as quickly as possible to my brother-in-law, who was waiting for me outside the airport, and so many police. I got out of the airport as best I could, and I managed to avoid being searched again. It was curious how many Spanish people lived there. In the afternoons, the Spanish women would meet to have coffee and talk about Spain. They even took their children to a library for Spanish lessons. My name is Belén Guerrero González. I was born in Yarila and I am 75 years old. I am the third oldest of my siblings. My father was a Guardia Civil officer and was transferred to Barcelona, where I had my first communion and I learnt Catalan. I stayed there until I was 12 years old, when my father was transferred back to Manresa. I started working there when I was 14, and even though I was a good student, my parents decided that I had to work. I started working in a bobbin factory and earned a good salary, which I always handed over to my mum at home so that she could manage it. When my father retired, he came to Plasencia, and I took the opportunity to study in Catalonia. I spent a whole year training in commerce and enrolled in a distance learning program for executive secretarial work and typing. It was difficult for me to get my mum to pay for my studies, even with my money. When I was 21, I came to Madrid to work at El Corte Ingles and decided to learn English and to go to England. My parents went ballistic. I had to contact a distant relative who was there because I don't think it was possible for them to let me go. In the end, I managed to do it. When I learned English properly, I went back to Spain and worked as an executive secretary in an import-export company that works in Ecuador, Brazil. After a while, I was transferred to Quito, where I stayed for 6 months. On the 5th of December, my flatmate and I went out for a drink, as I had to return to Spain on the 18th of December. And as life takes many twists and turns, I met the man I married on 15th of December of the same year before returning to Spain. When I went to the embassy to register the marriage, I was told that under Spanish law I was only allowed to marry in a civil ceremony. As soon as divorce was legalized in Spain, the civil marriage would be considered legal. But at the moment, that was not the case. They told me that in Spain only the church wedding was valid, that I should get married in Spain and then come back to get registered. My parents were upset because I didn't want to get married in a church, and I thought I was already married in a civil ceremony, and that was enough. And they were very upset about what people would say. So, to avoid upsetting my mother, I got married in a church in Spain, and just afterwards I got pregnant because, imagine if the pregnancy had happened before I walked down the aisle. I don't even want to imagine what would have happened. I continued my professional life in Ecuador for 31 years. And I also worked in the Austrian consulate and in German companies until I got divorced and came to Spain at the age of 57. Here I worked wherever I could to top up my pension contributions, town halls with elderly people, hotels, and I retired at 63. I had 2 children. The eldest is still in Ecuador and the youngest is in Lanzarote. They have given me several wonderful grandchildren. I take a positive view of my life despite the personal, work, and medical setbacks I have gone through, especially in the last 10 years. But I have learned from everything, and it has helped me to grow as a person. My name is Joana Granado Sanchez. I was born in Yarila and I am 85 years old. I grew up with an aunt, my mother's sister. My cousins and I were like brothers and sisters. My mother became a widow and remarried. She took me to school, but the teacher kept me as her maid instead of teaching me to read and write. She sent me to do chores at home, fetching water, throwing out the animals, looking after pots and pans. So my mother told me I couldn't go to school anymore, because if I worked for the teacher for free, we would have to find a job for which I was paid. So I forgot the little I knew about reading and writing. I started working as a day labourer, tending to peppers, tobacco, cotton, and looking after cattle. No matter how hot or cold it was, I never missed a day's work, and we almost had an empty belly because there was little to eat. One winter afternoon, when I was herding pigs, I was sitting sheltered in the trunk of an oak tree, and my mum's first cousin saw me and asked me what I was doing with my arms folded. And I told him, "What do you want me to do?" And he said to me, "Take a book to entertain yourself." And I said, "I can't read." And he told me, "Well, now you will learn." With a stick in the ground, I started to do maths and write words and then read what he wrote down for me to read, and so I learnt quite well. When I was 20, I was forced into marriage because my mother's husband got sick and she said they needed a man at home. So I had no childhood and no youth. I soon had my first son, and at 24 I had my daughter. We stayed and lived in Jarila, and I looked after my children, and my husband worked in the fields. After a while, my husband emigrated to France to pick apples with a group of men from Casas del Monte and two girls who were cooks. One of the cooks became pregnant, and I went to France to replace her. When I arrived in Iran, they gave us a medical checkup and fed us. The next day we arrived in Toulouse. I was very scared on the journey. At that time, ETA was in full swing. I worked in France for several apple picking seasons, but I worked in the factory picking and packing. I noticed that the country was way ahead of Spain. There was more money to be made, and there were mobile phones in those years. I was always treated well, and I treated everyone well. It annoyed me not to hear Spanish because I never spoke French, although I knew many words. The worst thing that happened to me there were the bleeding I had for 20 days, until one day I fell to the floor at work. I remember that they wanted to take me to the hospital because I needed a blood transfusion, and I refused and refused, among other things because it was going to cost me a lot of money, but especially because my ignorance made me think that if they gave me blood and it was from someone of colour, the baby might come out coloured, and I didn't want my husband to think that I had been with another man. Sometimes I wonder, with all the immigration nowadays, if we also went back to France then to take jobs from these people. My name is Adoracion Mendez Mendez. I am 75 years old and I was born in Guillo de Granadilla. My family was poor. We were 8 siblings. I was able to go to school until I was 12 years old. Then I alternated between school and work until I was 14. I got my school certificate and learned to read and write well. I was one of the older sisters, so when I finished school, I started working wherever I could find a job. In houses, as a day labourer, in orchards, in olive groves. When I was 18, I started a relationship with a boy who worked on the ponton, a bridge that was built in Guillo. We were engaged for a couple of years, and I got pregnant without being married. So you can imagine what that meant, especially socially. He would come to my mother's house for dinner to be with me, to slaughter the pigs. We had a normal life as boyfriend and girlfriend. That went on until I had my son. He lived in Plasencia, and when my father went to tell him that his son had been born, my father was surprised that my boyfriend was married and had another son. He got married on the 28th of October and continued to come home to me as if nothing had happened. My son was born on the 19th of December. Apparently, he was expecting another child with the other woman and decided in favor of this family. The birth went well. I was treated by the village doctor and Aunt Paulina, the shepherdess who acted as midwife. As I was so young, I hardly had any breast or milk to breastfeed the baby, so my mother spoke to the doctor, and they decided to reduce the milk from some goats we had with water, and with my little breast and the milk from the goats, my son was raised. Socially, having my son was hard. Imagine being unmarried and a single mother. Everything around me disappeared, friends, work. Luckily, my family always helped me with my son, and he grew up as the little brother of the family. Animals have always been treated as one of the family. My name is Maria del Pilar Martin Martin. I was born in Capizabelosa and I am 91 years old. My mother died when I was 14 years old, and I lived with my father after that, even after I was married. My father was mayor of this town for 14 years. I can remember, since I was a child, going with him to all the public events where the governor and other authorities came, and he always prepared a snack with sweets, coffee, and chocolate. I went to school until I was 14 years old, and I learnt to read, to write, to do housework, to sew, about religion. I was good in school, and the teacher tried to persuade my father to send me to a boarding school on a scholarship to continue my education. But my father was very close to me and didn't want to let me go. I got married at the age of 22, and at 24 I became a mother. I had my son, which was a very bad and complicated birth, and then my daughter arrived. The second pregnancy was different because I was treated in a clinic in Cáceres, and I gave birth there. In general, life has been good to me. There was no abundance, but I didn't starve, but a lot has changed from then to now. For example, we used to look forward to carnivals so we could wear makeup, and now women wear makeup every day. What shaped me the most was the death of my mother and not being able to share things in my life with her. Now I live alone in my little house and I am a widow. I am on my own, and at the moment I don't want to move in with my children, but I talk to them on my mobile phone every day. I spend my time reading. I love reading. Now I am writing a book about my life, and my grandchildren have encouraged me to do it. My name is Lorenza Montero Garcia. I am 79 years old, and although I was born on a farm near Gagera, I grew up in Capitapalosa. My parents had cattle, and that's why I was born on the Harala Torre farm. I went to school, but I didn't get my school leaving certificate because I didn't go regularly, because I had to help with the cattle at home. I learned to read and write the 4 basic rules and to embroider and sew, which helped me to fill my dowry for my wedding. When I was young, I worked as a day labourer in the cotton fields. I worked 5 picking seasons and earned 30 pesetas. We lived on the farm in a big room that the owner had given us, and we slept on big sacks of straw on the floor. And we took potatoes, chickpeas, oil, and we bought the rest when we went to the village, Carcabozo. I liked working to have my own money and to be able to buy some clothes for the village festivals. We didn't go hungry, but there was a shortage of everything. You might want to drink a glass of milk from the goats, and you couldn't because you had to make cheese to sell it. Then I got married and had 5 children. We went to live in a house that didn't even have an electricity meter, and with the money from the wedding, we bought it. We bought sheep and cows to work them, and I dedicated myself to my children and also helped with the cattle. We kept the cattle for about 15 years, and then we inherited the village inn that belonged to my husband's parents. My children were getting older, and we decided to turn the inn into a pub. We all worked in the pub for the 30 years that we had it, apart from having other jobs. It was a big sacrifice because the work in the bar had to be paid for little by little, but all the work stayed at home and has been for our children. We lived in the bar, we ate there, we had dinner there, we had snacks there. We only slept at home. I put the bar in my name to pay into the welfare system, as my husband was self-employed in the countryside. We also started paying into the system for my children until they found work. My name is Armeliana Simon Montero. I am 89 years old, and I was born in Guillo de Granadilla, in the same street where I live now. I was able to go to school, but only for a short time because we were 6 siblings, and we had to start working at an early age, and that is why I learnt to write outside of school. A neighbour taught me, and I don't know how to read. I started to look after cows. I served in houses. I went to pick olives and acorns. I weeded. I picked peppers. I gathered cork. I mowed. I made cheese. I don't even remember how much I was paid for my work, but I'm sure they would give us some money. When I went to look after the cows, I spent the whole way sleeping on the donkey that the owner had left for me. And because I left the house so early, the little donkey would come to me on its own and already knew the way. To make sure the cows didn't run away, I learned to use the onda, a kind of big slingshot that would sling a stone. Back then, we always walked to and from work, and we spent the whole way singing and with our guts rumbling because we were so hungry. Because I spent so much time in the countryside, every year I would collect the eggs from the nests of partridges and pigeons because I knew where they were, but only because I was hungry and never to hurt the bird. I remember one day when we were on the bridge at Capara and my sister Flora wanted to eat eggs, and we had no other idea than to tie a rope around me as I was smaller, so that I could be let down to get the eggs from the swallows' nests under the bridge. I was able to collect the eggs, but of course she couldn't hold my weight either, and instead of pulling me up, she had to let me fall into the water, so I lost almost all the eggs I had collected. We also hunted lizards, frogs, and fish with an iron rod. We didn't really go hungry, but I worked a lot. We planted vegetable gardens to supply the house with potatoes, chickpeas, wheat, vegetables. Over the years, I got married and had 3 daughters. I continued to work, but I was never legally registered to pay into the program for social benefits and to retire with a pension. Look at how hard my mother, Paulina, the midwife, worked to help the entire village with all the births, and she never received anything. People paid what they could, and if they couldn't, they just thanked her. My name is Aureliana Garcia Berrocal. I'm 82 years old and was born in Guillo de Granadilla. We were 5 siblings. I learnt to read and write, but I'm not very good at it. I also learnt to add and subtract, but I'm not too good at dividing and multiplying. I went to school until I was 11 years old, and what I was taught the most was sewing. I wasn't very good at learning, so I left school and worked at home with my parents. My father had land to farm and livestock to keep, so I had no shortage of work. I milked goats, collected and mucked out the stables, picked olives and acorns, weeded wool, fetched water from the well for drinking and for the household, mowed, tilled, brought food to the mowers who worked with us, and so on. I only have a few memories of playing with rag dolls that our grandmothers made for us, playing with marbles or the spinning top, and so on. I remember the clothes I wore because they were always patched clothes, and the shoes with rubber soles that I couldn't stand, so I was always barefoot, even in the countryside. We had fun dancing in the square with a drummer, and our parents bought us sweets, but nothing more. Then I got married and moved to Conflans because my husband worked in construction there. We had 4 children. With the first, I spent most of the pregnancy in Conflans, but I was afraid to give birth there. I eventually returned to the village to give birth. During the birth, I was looked after by the village doctor and Aunt Paulina, the midwife. I recovered and returned to Conflans. Over the years, I devoted myself to my children and the house, but once they were grown up, I began to build my professional future by working in all kinds of jobs: cooking, hotels, cleaning. I remember earning 800 pesetas as a cook. As soon as we were able to retire, we returned to the village. We are still here with a very different life than before. My name is Veronica Granado. I am 79 years old and was born in Yarila. There were 5 children in my family. My father was a security guard, and it's not that we went hungry, but there was a lack of everything. My siblings and I were very mischievous towards each other. We were always arguing, but I think it was just because we were hungry. I remember that we were always looking for food in the kitchen cupboard and in the chests to find something to eat. We went to school, but the teachers didn't teach much back then. I learnt to read and write, a few Spanish rivers, and how to make rag dolls, but little else. When I was 9 years old, I left school to work in the fields, harvesting peppers and olives, sowing barley and wheat, tilling, and so on. That's why it's very difficult for me to read and write now. I confess that when I used to go to work, I used to steal watermelons or melons, peppers, and tomatoes. To be honest, I asked for them first, but there were owners who didn't want to give me anything, so necessity forced me to steal. I hid them in the furrows with a sign, and when I had finished work and the owner was no longer there, I took them home. When my sister got married, I left the village and moved with her to Bilbao, where I took care of my nephew when he was born. It was there that I met my husband, who was also from Jarila, but left the village when he was little. But to tell the truth, I no longer knew him. We were engaged for 4 years and then got married in Jarila. We lived in my mother-in-law's house at first, but as soon as we could, we rented a house. We both worked and saved for the deposit on a flat, and as soon as we had the money together, we travelled to Bilbao, paid the deposit, and took out a mortgage for the rest. I remember we paid 100 pesetas for the mortgage and ended up paying 500 pesetas. I worked in 2 houses for 40 years, looking after the children. We got on like a family. I still have contact with the children because their parents have since passed away. Although I have worked for so many years, I've never paid into the welfare system, so I am retired but without a pension. Later, when my husband retired and our children were already employed, we decided to return to the village. It's very quiet here and life is very good. I'm not saying it was bad in Bilbao, but we went through some very hard years with the ETA terrorist group, and you don't forget these things. My name is Francisca Matia Parra. I was born in La Granja and I'm 84 years old. My family was poor. The truth is that everyone was poor back then. There were only 3 or 4 rich people in each village. We were 4 sisters, one of them with physical disabilities. I remember my mother always telling us to go to school. She never stopped us. That enabled me to learn to read and write well and to do maths well. Until I was 16, I worked in Plasencia for a bigwig from Morocco. I looked after his son. At some point, the man wanted to move to his own country and offered me the chance to come with him, but I wasn't sure and neither was my family. Morocco was a long way from Spain and we were scared. The man told me not to worry because if I had to come back to Spain, I would have a plane at my disposal without any problems. But he couldn't convince me with that either. I went back to my parents and started working for them. I got married at the age of 21 and we opened a bar which I managed. My husband started to grow crops and we sold them directly without middlemen. Business was going well for us, and we decided to buy a lorry to transport our produce ourselves. When I had the bar, a baker offered to sell me bread. I didn't have to worry about anything. He brought me the baskets of bread and took what was left over, and that's what I did. The sale of bread led to the purchase of other products such as sugar, rice, oats, maize. Eventually, we set up a shop next door, and while I served a glass of wine, I sold a few tomatoes as well. I ran the bar and the shop for 28 years. Then I closed the bar and kept the shop until I retired. Although I ran the bar and shop myself, I was only able to register for 8 years, as it was impossible to pay self-employment rates for the social welfare system for two people, and we decided to let my husband pay as he drove the lorry and took more risks. We had two children. My mother and sister helped me with them, and I was able to give them both an education. I am currently a widow and receive a small pension. I pay the costs for my house and the residential home where I live. My hobbies include reading, crossword puzzles, painting. I also help my great-granddaughter with her multiplication tables. My name is Elena Sanchez Lopez. I am 86 years old and I was born, raised, and married in the same street where I live in La Granja. I was born when the war broke out. My parents grew tobacco, peppers, and grains for us and to sell. They also had vegetable gardens for our own use, and every year they fattened a few pigs for slaughter. We even slaughtered a few suckling pigs to eat at home. Not all of them were sold. By that I mean that we didn't go hungry, but we also couldn't eat our fill whenever we wanted. I went to school and learnt to read, write, and do housework. I worked at home with my parents, but sometimes I worked as a day labourer to have some money of my own. They didn't want me to work, but I liked to have a few pesetas in my pocket. When I was 17 years old, I went to Salamanca to work for the family who lived in the Abbey Palace. I worked there for 5 years. I took care of the household, cleaned, took the children to school, answered the phone. I sent all the money I earned to my mum. At the age of 24, I married my husband, who was from La Vera. We met because he used to work in Sasa di Granadilla and then came to La Granja to dance. Our parents each gave us a mule and we started to work the land. We devoted ourselves to sowing hectares and began to hire day labourers to do the work. We had 3 children. 2 of them were twins. The birth of the twins was complicated. I was in a very bad way. I was so ill that I had to be taken to hospital in Plasencia, otherwise we could have given birth at home. The memory of the life I have lived is good, but hard, because I had to work a lot. My name is Juana Gonzalez Sanchez. I am 86 years old. I was born in La Granja and I will stay here until I die. My memory of school is very poor. I had to stop going to school to work, so I didn't learn to read or write. People used to work from an early age, and sometimes you only worked for a plate of food. People were in great need. I started working growing peppers, tobacco, and everything else. We worked from sunrise to sunset. I don't know how we managed to put up with so much. And on top of that, we went singing and came back singing. My God, what a life! I got married at the age of 24. My husband went to work in Germany for a few years, and I stayed behind alone with my daughter. I continued to work as a day labourer. When I could, I grew vegetables for the household and kept goats, chickens, and pigs for my own use. When my husband returned, he started working as the village crier at Grania Town Hall. He made announcements in the streets and played a small trumpet. He collected the rubbish with a donkey and a cart. He did whatever he was asked to do. I stopped working as a day labourer and set up a boarding house in my home. I provided meals and a bed for anyone who wanted to sleep. Although I have worked all my life, I have never paid into the welfare system to be able to retire and receive a pension. Over the years, I also had to look after my parents and my parents-in-law, who were getting old and ill. I've worked all my life. When I became a widow, I started drawing my husband's pension. I lived alone in my house for a few years, but I decided to move into sheltered housing because at least I have some company here. My name is Felicitas Palomero Montero. I was born in Guillo de Granadilla and I'm 82 years old. I am currently the mother of 3 daughters, as 2 of my sons have passed away. My father Silvestre was a blacksmith in Guillo. He had a forge, and my mother Inocencia was a housewife. My sister Pura and I were born at a time when resources were scarce to meet the special needs of so many children. We were born with congenital deafness, but we are not deaf and dumb, as we have been called all our lives. We have vocal cords, but since we can't hear anything, we haven't learned to speak. We only make simple sounds like bread, water, daddy, mummy. Back then, it took a very long time for our deafness to be diagnosed. This delayed my access to school. I started school at the age of 8. The teachers at the time were not prepared to deal with special educational needs. The school helped me to learn how to sew, embroider, and little else. There were no special schools in Caceres back then. My parents were the ones who taught me how to spell words and what they meant. I learnt them by heart because I couldn't hear the sound. That's how we created our own language, which we still use today. I spent a few years in the village school, and I think at the age of 12 I was taken to a special school in Madrid. There I learnt to make lutes and little else. What I learnt best was to go hungry. Fortunately, my father visited me often and he confirmed that I had lost weight very quickly. I spent very hard and sad months there, although my family sent me food and clothes. I never got anything. We girls had a terrible time. The only good memory was the zoo, which my father always took me to when he came to Madrid. One day my father turned up at school unexpectedly and discovered what it was really like. He found me with torn clothes that didn't belong to me, crying next to the door to the street. They opened the door for him, he took me by the hand and we went out into the street. There was a wild orange on the ground. I picked it up and started to eat it with the peel. I remember my father taking me in his arms, throwing the orange so far away that I could no longer see, starting to cry and taking me to a bar. I drank warm milk and ate a bread roll. I still remember the feeling. My father didn't say a word the whole time. When I finished, he took me to a taxi waiting for him, asked him for a pen and paper, and wrote something down. Then we drove past the school. He handed the piece of paper to the porter and we drove to the village. During my life, I have seen what society is like and that it is not prepared to accept differences. I've been lucky in my neighborhood and with the friends I've always had. I have noticed difficulties in my life. For example, not being able to explain situations to my children, not knowing what is happening until I see it, not being able to travel alone, not understanding a film 100%, and 1,000 other everyday situations. But perhaps this lack reinforces other senses. I have not been able to form normal relationships outside of my environment, but that has not hindered me in anything else. I've always had the support of my parents and now my daughters, granddaughters, and great granddaughter, none of whom are deaf, thankfully. My name is Gertrudis Sanchez Gomez. I'm 82 years old and was born in Azabal. We are 4 siblings, Pilar, Benito, Carmen, and myself. When I was 12 years old, my parents arranged a job for me in Casa de Palomero to work in a house. The owners had a soda factory. I was a maid in their house. I did the housework, looked after the goats, fetched water, etc. I earned 100 pesetas. From the age of 7 to 12, I wasn't able to go to school much. Work always came first. When I was 16, I went to Madrid to work as a maid. At that time, a salary of 500 pesetas was normal. I was there for 2.5 years. There were also girls I knew from the village, so on Thursdays and Sunday afternoons, we would walk around the city together. We had those days off. When I was in Madrid, I met my husband, Floro, the wolf hunter, El Lobero, who was doing his military service there with another boy from Casar. We were engaged for 3 years and finally got married and moved to Mojidas de Granadilla because my husband is from Mojidas. We had 5 children, Bienve, Manolo, Florencia, Pili, and Antonio. My husband was called a wolf hunter because his brother and father hunted wolves, hence the nickname. I dedicated myself to my family and to bringing up my children. I had to look after the household because Flora went to work in Switzerland. I looked after the vegetable garden, the livestock, the olives, and my children. I have 9 grandchildren, and I am busy making woolen hats, duvets, cushions, rugs, and tablecloths. On Sundays, I watch the church service on television. And that was my life, looking after others and working. My name is Petronila Garcia Batuecas. I am 78 years old and was born in Cerezo. I have 3 siblings and was taken out of school at the age of 11 to herd sheep because my father became ill. I herded sheep from the age of 11 until I was 18. When I was 18, I married my husband and came to Mojidas de Granadilla. I had 2 sons, Antonio y Felix, and a daughter, Anna. The last time I gave birth, I fell ill and could only work to a limited extent, and that's why I told my husband that we should open a grocery shop, and we did. I worked there until I was 45 years old. I have 5 granddaughters, Alba, Leila, Paula, Ayatana, and Raquel, a 7-year-old great-grandson, Jorge, and a 1-year-old great-granddaughter, Carla. I am currently sewing, painting, and preparing the dowry for my granddaughters. I also like to make lace. I represented Extremadura in its pavilion at the Expo in Sevilla. I'm a very active person. I play bingo, I do my own housework, I help out at church. Whenever someone needs something, I help them. My name is Teresa Tomas Blasquez. I am 86 years old. I was born and grew up in Palomero. I was born in 1936 into a modest family and didn't go to school very often. From the age of 9, I went to pick olives. My brothers Maximo, Julian, and Emilio and I were sent to school at night by my mother to learn to read and write. My mum always worked a lot. She had a vegetable garden, she mowed and picked olives. My father had a leg disease. That's why my brothers started working when they were very young, and I started doing the housework. I married my husband, Agustin, at the age of 23. We had been together since I was 18, but we had to wait to get married because he had to do military service. Since my marriage, I've dedicated myself to raising my son and looking after the older members of my family. My father, two of my husband's uncles, and my father-in-law. I have a son, Juan, and two granddaughters, Maria and Virginia. Maria has two children, Hector and Marcos, who are my great-grandchildren. I love books, sewing, documentaries, and series. I write rhymes. I would have liked to spend more time in my life on the intellectual side. I would have liked to study what I like. We had few material things, but there was no lack of affection at home, and my brothers always took good care of me. My name is Maria Mercedes Paniagua Marimer. I'm 75 years old and was born in Ahigal. My father, who was a village teacher, took me to school in Plasencia when I was 11 years old. I had a religious vocation, and at the age of 15 I joined the Congregación de las Josefinas de la Santísima Trinidad de Plasencia, Congregation of the Josephine Sisters of the Holy Trinity of Plasencia. I went to France for a year, then to Bilbao, and from there to Chile. In Chile, I worked as a missionary for 22 years and helped the neediest people. I started various things in Chile, such as the Rosary of the Dawn or sang Hail Mary. I am an educator and primary school teacher and have given music lessons. I have also helped elderly and sick people. After 40 years as a nun, I came to Spain, left the congregation, and married Francisco, Paco, who was a former student of my father. We moved to Plasencia. Now we live in Ahigal, and apart from looking after Paco, I love visiting sick people. I teach children to sing in catechism classes. My life has always been about helping others. My name is Antolina Plataroano. I'm 79 years old and I come from Ahigal. I was born, grew up, and live in Ahigal. I am an only child. My mum was a bit of an authoritarian and I was a bit of a rebel. I went to school until I was 14, and because I didn't want to go to school anymore, I started going out with Crispin, my husband. I got married at 22 and we moved into my parents' house until we found another house to rent. Within 4 years, I had a son and two daughters, Jesus, Isabel, and Alicia. And I have 5 grandchildren: Nico, Andrea, Pablo, Adrian, and Alvaro. I've had a very happy life with my family. I used to go to the fields with my father to mow and pick olives. He taught me any old songs that are still sung today in the folklore group El Chiqueral. I have also looked after 9 people in my family: my mother-in-law, brother-in-law, uncle, godmother, among others, as well as my children. We have a lot of fun as a family. We have all gone on trips and cruises together. My husband is the best. He does everything. He has written 7 books and sells them. He helps me a lot when I'm ill. In my spare time, I like to read, knit, swim in the pool, and go out. My name is Maria Cáceres Batuecas. I am 76 years old and I am from Ahigal. We are 4 siblings: Anacieto, Anastasio, Felisa, and me. My mother died when I was 18 years old. My parents took any job they were offered and went to work in the countryside because they didn't have their own land. I didn't go to school very often, but have always enjoyed reading. What I know I learnt as an adult. When I was 14 years old, I worked in the cotton fields in Casablanca, picked olives, and worked on a farm with my sister to do all the agricultural work. At the age of 23, I married my husband, who has also always worked in the fields. I have 2 children, Maria Jesus and José Carlos, and 2 grandchildren, Dani and Nacho. I like walking, sewing. I'm in the Women's and Senior Citizens Association, and I sometimes read poetry. My name is Ascension Garcia Garcia, Joni. I'm 75 years old and I was born and grew up in Ahigal. My parents were from Ahigal. My mother was a seamstress and my father worked in the fields. I have a brother, Julian. When I was 10 years old, my parents had already passed away. I went to school until I was 14. My brother and I moved in with our paternal grandfather. He had worked in the fields since he was very young. I devoted myself to housework. I wasn't allowed to go out because I had had to mourn the death of my parents and my grandmother since I was 7 years old. I grieved until I was 17. We were only allowed to go to church, and I had to go to confession every week. When we sneaked off to the dance, it was in secret, without anyone knowing. We couldn't talk to boys or anything. I married my husband, Marcial, when I was 21. I have 2 sons, Timoteo and Jesus Manuel, 2 grandsons, Raul and Borja, and 2 granddaughters, Alba and Lucia. We decided to go to Madrid to work. We lived in Madrid for 28 years. My husband worked in construction and I worked in childcare. I love to paint, go to adult school to learn, sew and write. I'm president of the Women's Association. In short, I'm very active. My name is Primitiva Martin Mendez, Tiva. I am 85 years old and I come from Marjagas. I have 2 daughters and a son, Carmela, Isabel and Claudio. 4 grandchildren, Anna, Antonio, Alberto and Claudio, and a great-granddaughter, Ines. My parents also came from Marjagas and worked in the fields and with animals. I attended the Immaculate Conception School in Plasencia for 5 years. I then left school at the age of 17 and went to pick chestnuts and olives and looked after animals. I married my husband Petronilo at the age of 22. We have now been married for 65 years. We have always worked in the fields, but my husband also worked as secretary of the Chamber of Agriculture in the neighbouring villages. In addition to the housework, I looked after the family and my children, transported the olives, and took our day labourers to the fields. I like to paint pictures, tablecloths, fans, and I also sew and crochet. My husband and I have always gone on holiday. We've been on cruises and to the Feria di Sevilla. I have a vegetable garden that I plant, sow, and harvest myself. I've had a very happy life, even though bad things have happened to us, but I've been very happy. My name is Araceli Corquero Anton. I am 85 years old and was born in Santa Cruz de Paniagua, but I grew up on a farm in El Bronco. I have a sister, Amparo, and a brother, Cesar. I went to school until I was 15 and then went to Madrid to study general culture. My parents worked on the farm where I grew up in the fields and with the animals. My father was also secretary of the Farmers and Livestock Breeders Association and managed the farm where we lived. He also set up the first telephone exchange in our area. When I was 25 years old, I married my husband, Felipe. We moved to Madrid and had my daughter, Paloma, and my children, Felipe and Araceli, who were twins. I have a granddaughter, Alba, and a grandson, Jorge. I still live in Madrid, but I come to the village on holiday. I love writing, reading, etc. My life has been very happy, although I've had hard times, but I've been very happy. My name is Isabel Martin Munoz. I'm 86 years old and born and raised in Santa Cruz. My parents worked in the fields tending sheep and goats. We are 2 brothers and 3 sisters, Felipe, Maximo, Ampara, Clotilde, and myself. I went to school until I was 15 years old, but from an early age we worked in the fields and around the house. When I was 28, I married my husband Felix, to whom I had been engaged for 10 years. We also set up a bar where we worked for 43 years. We have a daughter, Estrella, and a son, and we have 2 granddaughters, Paula and Isabel, and a grandson, Matteo. We worked a lot in the bar from early in the morning until late at night. Now I crochet quilts, bedspreads, baby slippers, and hats. The summary of my life is that it was a good life, even though we worked a lot. My name is Rosario Gil Martin La Cafetera. I am 81 years old and I come from Santibáñez El Bayo. I had 2 siblings. My father, Doroteo, dedicated himself to building stone huts in the countryside, and my mother, Irene, did the housework. I didn't go to school. My mother died very young and I had to work the land with my father. He taught me the letters so that I could learn to read. From an early age, I tended the pigs, sowed and harvested the produce from the vegetable garden, etc. When my mum died, I grieved for 3 years. I couldn't go anywhere except to church. I married my husband Antonio when I was 20 years old. He was a coffee seller who bought it in Portugal and then sold it here in the village. We have 4 sons and 3 daughters, Antonio, Jesus, Jose Maria, Angelica, Guadalupe, Oscar und Irene. 13 grandsons and granddaughters and 2 great-grandsons. We were married for 56 years until my husband passed away. We were always together as a team. My husband stopped selling coffee and dedicated himself to buying and selling horses. The whole family is carrying on his legacy. I have devoted myself to housework and looking after my family. I enjoy sewing regional costumes, reading poetry, and acting. My life is very happy, and I am grateful for the family I have. I am Regina Rodriguez Gonzalez, and I am 89 years old. I was born and grew up in Cerezo, and my parents, Celidorio and Segunda, also came from Cerezo. We were 3 sisters and 1 brother. My parents always worked in the fields, and my father delivered the post in the villages by donkey until he got a car. My sister and I took over my father's work as postman. We earned 1 peseta a day. As we women hadn't been allowed to work in this job in the past, my father was the one who had to sign for everything. His boss realized one day that we were the ones doing the work. We didn't go to school very often, and in the afternoons we went to the sheep, the goats, the olive trees, or to wash in the stream. I married my husband Miguel, who was an officer in the Guardia Civil at the age of 26, and who was stationed in Granada until he was transferred to Plasencia. I devoted myself to looking after my children and doing housework. When he retired, we returned to Cerezo, where we had olive trees and a vegetable garden. Now we no longer have the olive trees and the vegetable garden because we are very old. We have been married for 63 years and have a son, Miguel, and a daughter, Maria Jesus, and a grandson, Jose Miguel, who is in France. My life has been a very happy one. My name is Leonides Rivero Viejo. I am 90 years old and I was born and live in La Pesca. My parents, Narcisa and Valentin, also came from La Pesca. Although my mother had 9 children, only 3 are still alive, Juan, Amelia, and me. I went to school until I was 7 years old. I looked after the goats and pigs, washed clothes in the river, did the housework, etc. My mother raised my siblings and me alone. Because she had separated from my father, we had to work a lot from an early age, picking olives, cotton, and peppers, until I married my husband Dionisio at the age of 22. We had 4 daughters, Melania, Amelia, Cari, and Montagna, and 4 sons, Jesus, Domingo, Flores, and Diony. I have 19 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren, a very large family. I had a son who fell ill and we had to take him to the doctor on a donkey. We had a hard time until he got well again. My husband was the village crier for 14 years, and I looked after all my children, the vegetable garden, the pigs, the chickens, and the goats. When I was 64, we came to Mojedas, where some of my children live, because my husband and I were ill. I have always loved sewing and crocheting. My life has been cruel, and although we were happy, we also had a hard time. My name is Concha Martin Anaya. I am 78 years old and I was born in El Bronco, but came to Palomero when I was 14. I only went to school for a short time because I was an only child. I didn't want to go to school anymore. I wanted to come home to be with my parents. They worked in the fields and I did the housework, went to the stream to do the washing and pick olives. There was no running water in the houses, and at that time work was being carried out in the village to supply running water to everyone. I married my husband when I was 21, and we moved in with my parents, where we lived all our lives until they died. We had a son, Juan Carlos, and a daughter, Eva Maria. I also have 3 granddaughters. All my life, I have looked after the family, my children, elderly people like my parents in law, aunts, and uncles. I have also worked for the Agricultural Employment Program, PER. I enjoy going for walks in my free time. I have embroidered many bed sheets and crocheted linen. In short, my life was very peaceful and happy. My husband was also very good to me. The only thing I regret is that I didn't